It's called Forgetting My Mother. And the forgetting part is because my mother died when I was 8 years old. And I, in my grief, gradually suppressed all memories of this woman, Pauline Spittler-Cryer. Now, the amazing thing is also, that was also true of my older brothers. My brother David was 16 when she died. He had very few memories of her as well. My brother John was 13, and I had a younger sister, Kathy, who was just 6. But we all suppress those memories. So let me just set the scene here with the opening paragraphs of this book. I was once a preacher's kid named Danny. This was not all bad. In fact, in the church-centered society that was my hometown in northwestern Ohio, it was distinctly a badge of honor. Churches sprouted in Findlay, like delis in New York City. There was one on nearly every corner. In 1950, when I turned 7, there were about 45 churches serving a population of almost 24,000 Findlayites. My father, the Reverend Donald Cryer, presided over the 2,100 member First Methodist Church, an imposing Romanesque edifice that eventually filled an entire block near the center of town. Church-going was part of Findlay's natural order, as inevitable as going to school. As a boy, you attended Sunday school and Sunday services, sang in the children's choir, thrilled to tales of Jacob's Ladder and Noah's Ark at summer vacation Bible school, joined the Boy Scouts for knot tying in the church basement, played second base on the church softball team. Church, as much as school, was where you met your friends and found a girlfriend. To be unchurched so-called, was rare, an admission that something had gone awry in your upbringing. In the Findlay that I knew, being Christian meant being Protestant. St. Michael's was the sole Catholic parish, never producing the critical mass of students to require a parochial high school. So the few Catholic kids in town attended Findlay High, alongside young communicants from First Methodist, First Presbyterian, Trinity Episcopal, First Lutheran, Mason Chapel AME, Calvary Baptist, and all the rest. There were only a handful of Jewish families in town and no synagogue. In my Bible-soaked mind, Jews were legendary Old Testament characters rather than people living in the contemporary world. The lone exception was Marlene Kay, my 7th grade girlfriend, whose family seems to have materialized out of nowhere and soon thereafter just as quickly vanished. Being a PK was mostly a blessing. It guaranteed me parents who loved me, pats on the head from kindly church ladies, and in the grandest scheme of things, an inside track on salvation. Of course, this condition also ruled out a lot of excitement. Too many people were looking over your shoulder, ensuring that you followed the path of righteousness. So no one ever taught me to swear, smoke, or drink. Sex was forbidden premarital territory. No, I was too good for all that, too square, too white bread. Niceness was bred into me the way scions of the rich pick up a sense of entitlement about admission to the Ivy League. I was weaned on it from birth. I was weaned. If you can't say anything nice, the family mantra went, don't say anything at all. Nice was simply the way people were, wasn't it? Certainly the folks I encountered at church were. It took many years to learn a basic truth. The world, which operated on less forgiving premises wasn't designed to do me any favors. So that's the intro to my book, is kind of setting the scene of Findlay and my particular niche within Findlay. So why did I write this book? I wrote this book because, as I said earlier, I had suppressed all memories of this woman, Pauline Spittler Cryer. And so there was this dawning, eventually, there's gradually this sense of a hole in my heart. There was this grand mystery. Who was this woman? Who was this mystery woman anyway? I mean, I had been told, well, she was very nice. She was kind of shy. She was usually stayed in the bathroom, not in the bathroom, the background, sorry. So, you know, these couple of adjectives really didn't explain much. I wanted to know, who was she? Who she really was? And I've always been very curious about history ever since I was a boy. I used to read those little landmark books about the biographies of famous people. And I eventually trained as a historian, went to work as a journalist. So curiosity about the past and curiosity about the present has always been a central part of my life. I think things really kicked off, they really hit home when my older daughter, Julie, turned 8 years old. And I said, oh my God, what if I suddenly died and Julie couldn't remember me at all? I couldn't imagine that. Would she not remember that I taught her how to ride a bike? Would she not remember that I invented bedtime stories about two snakes called Slither and Slather? You know, all that, would all that be lost the way it had been lost for me? And so gradually over time, of course, she turned 8 a long time ago. I was too busy with my career, with raising a family, to really devote much time to this and do much research. But eventually, this is only probably starting about 10 years ago, I really began to do this in earnest. I wanted to somehow create, at least in part, the woman who lived instead of the mother who died. A sense of a real person. And I wanted to understand her milieu. And her milieu, at its most basic, was Hoytville, a little hamlet near North Baltimore and Wood County, just north of you, and Findlay. So I did lots of research. So what were my sources for this story? First of all, I didn't have many people to interview because I started so late. Any people who had known her, for the most part, were gone. They were dead. I did a lot of internet research, and of course, nowadays you can do a lot of that right from home, and that was extremely helpful. And about 15 years ago, I discovered that my mother had left some diaries that my sister had held, and I never knew that they even existed. And she'd had them in her basement or attic somewhere. And when I discovered them, I began to read them, and they were just, they started when she was in college at Bowling Green, and they continued only through the birth of her first child. And they were very fragmentary. They didn't tell me much, but every now and then they would hint at emotions and what her thoughts and feelings were, not just everyday events. So I had that as a starting place. There were family Christmas letters. My father always wrote a Christmas letter every year, and that included details about the family that were interesting and helpful. And believe it or not, the main New York Public Library is a big research library, and there is a division of local history and genealogy. And I actually found several histories of Findlay there. There was even a centennial history of Hoytville. Can you imagine? Hoytville has maybe 200 residents now, and it didn't have many in the 1950s and before, but they had it. I went to Findlay. I used microfilm at the Findlay Public Library to read the Republican Courier from several years in the early 50s, just to kind of get a sense of what Findlay was like. Some of you may remember the column Cream for My Morning Coffee, which was a local column by Peg. I'm forgetting her last name now, but anyway.
Peg Dennis. We have several people in the
yes, Peg
in the
Dennis.
audience shouting out. Yep.
Peg Dennis. Yes. I went up to Bowling Green to the University Library there and looked at yearbooks and the college newspaper on microfilm. I looked at some of the local small newspapers from the area. I think from North Baltimore and Deschler, those metropolises, you know, up there, just to get a sense of the life in this little hamlet. Also, because I wanted to understand the effect of this death on me personally, I wanted to continue the story to say, what was the impact of this death on my own life, my adult life? So I did a lot of research into grieving and grieving in different eras, what it was like in America, say in the 50s. I did a lot of research on memory. How do we remember? What do we remember? What do we forget? So I use all these sources to create what I call a pointillist portrait. You know, it's not complete, but it did give me a sense of just who she was in a way that I had never understood before. And there were some surprises. Let me tell you a bit about some of the surprises I discovered. Well, the first one was that my family actually had those diaries. And I also discovered that one of my aunts had some letters that were the last letters my mother wrote to us children. She died from hypertension, something that can be controlled very well with drugs nowadays. This is in 1952. She was sent to a hospital in Boston to be treated for surgery, of all things. And they did an operation called a sympathectomy. And then they cut some of the nerves right at the top of the spine that regulate the sympathetic nervous system, which regulates blood pressure. He was a very famous surgeon. He was extremely successful, practically 99% of the time. He was not successful with my mother. But I did discover these letters that she had sent back to the kids back in Findlay right before she died. That was just about 5 years ago. I discovered a really poignant moment through reading the Republican Courier in 1952. My older brother, David, played on the football team. And on a Saturday night in October of 1952, he scored the winning touchdown against Toledo de Vilbis. And it was quite an upset because Toledo had a much better record than the Trojans did. That was on Saturday night. David went out and celebrated. David was a local hero. On Wednesday, the next week, we learned that our mother had died. So that I never knew this juxtaposition of this wonderful family celebration and then this unexpected death. Total shock. One of the few people that I did interview in Findlay, some of you may know the name Emma Mae Gray. Emma Mae died, I think, just a few years ago. I interviewed her when she was 98, and her mind was still very sharp. I remember her telling me she used to ride around town, all over town on her bike and out into the country. Anyway, she told me a story I had never remembered at all. She said that she and another woman babysat me and my younger sister at various times after my mother died. And she said, "You were crying Danny. That's what we called you. You were just inconsolable. You couldn't play, you couldn't do anything." And of course, I had no memory of that at all. But of course, it was a testimony to how deeply this death had affected me. I learned a lot about my mother. The main thing is I learned that she was not shy at all. In high school, she acted in plays. In high school, she gave humorous readings in competitions. I discovered this is part of the memorabilia that my sister had. In the high school yearbook in Hoytville, her sophomore year, they had a saying that each student contributed about themselves. And Pauline's was, "I'll do anything once." And I thought, really? This prim and proper minister's wife would do anything? I thought, well, maybe not anything. But it reflected a feistiness and lightheartedness that, I didn't remember at all, of course. She also said in that yearbook that she aspired to be a movie star. Now, in my family, we didn't even go to movies very often. We had to consult Parents Magazine to see if a movie was okay for children, before we were allowed to go. I also learned that she was a bit of a flirt. Several of the students in that yearbook described her as having goo-goo eyes, which was a phrase used in the late 20s. And it meant you were kind of using those eyes to flirt with boys. And from those diaries, I learned that she had a very active social life. She could not have been a shy person at all. She was a member of a sorority. She went to lots of parties. She went to athletic events. She went to movies. And to my shock, she was vice president of her senior class. Now, keep in mind that the Bowling Green of that era was a tiny college, not like the large university it is today of 30,000 students maybe. It had no graduate programs. And it was mainly a teacher preparation institution. But anyway, she was vice president of her college class, which is a surprise to me. After college, she went to Toledo. She became a home economics teacher at Toledo Whitmer, which at that point was a brand new high school on the west side of the city near the Michigan state line. She directed plays there, I discovered, from delving into some of the history of Whitmer and some of the materials I found there. Now, you can't be shy and direct plays. You all know that. Um, and there's a wonderful story that I learned. I think this is from Emma May Gray as well. She said that she and my mother were a group of women who were invited to tea one day. And I believe this was also on West Sandusky Street by kind of a grande dame of Findlay at the time named Helen Barnes. Some of you may know that name. Helen Barnes was very active in the international YWCA. She traveled the world over on behalf of the YWCA. And she had this kind of arrogant, haughty manner. So she invited these ladies to tea at her house. And as they were leaving, she instructed them to help clean up the kitchen, including mopping the floor. And Emma Gray said, as my mother was leaving the house, she said, well, maybe we won't be available the next time she invites us. So she had that spirit of feistiness, you know, that she had as a teenager, even as an adult. And I think the main thing I discovered too from this research is that the values that I always attributed coming from my father, such values as intense curiosity about the world, a love of learning, a sense of deep spirituality, kindness, they didn't just come from my father, they came from my mother as well. So in trying to understand myself, as I said, I did a lot of research on grief, and especially grief among white Protestants in the 1950s. And I think, especially among white Protestants, there was a sense that you were not even supposed to use the word died or death. You could, in a condolence letter, you wouldn't use those, you weren't supposed to use those words. That's what the etiquette books told you. It was kind of a stiff upper lip attitude, a stoicism. You know, contrasted with, say, an Irish wake where there's lots of storytelling, sitting around telling stories about the person who's died, or a Jewish sitting Shiva where, again, there's more storytelling about the departed. Back in the 80s, I visited my father in Dayton, Ohio, where he was living at the time. And the whole sole purpose was to try to find out more about my mother. And of course, my father had repressed as much as his children had. And at this point, he was long remarried to my stepmother. And I think there was a sense of loyalty to her that he couldn't talk about his first wife. And a sense that, you know, Pauline had really been the great love of his life. And he was so hurt by it himself that he had repressed memories of her. He couldn't help me at all. I was kind of desperate for answers, but he just could not help. And we had a series of letters back and forth. And at one point I got very angry with him. And, you know, eventually, and he apologized. He said, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. I can't help you, but I can't. And I have to underscore that my father, I don't mean to say unkind things about my father. I think that was simply the milieu that he was from. The 1950s stiff upper lip attitude. Emma May Gray told me that my grandmother told her that in the morning after the kids went to school, My father would shut himself in his study and cry. But he did it when we weren't there, when we weren't watching. And then he went out and was strong for his family and for his congregation. What is different now about grieving and young children? Now, the counselors will tell you, the psychotherapists will tell you, you need to talk. If you want to preserve the memories of the person who died, you need to talk about it. Even the kids who feel like they don't want to, you will really help them by allowing them to talk, giving them permission to talk about it, to express their opinions, to allow them to say, I'm angry, I feel abandoned. That's the way they will remember the person they've lost. Talk therapy is necessary to preserve memories. I remember I met Peg Dennis's daughter at the church when I was doing my research. And she gave me a lot of her mother's columns. And after we finished and she left, I turned around, and to my astonishment, on a table, there were a whole series of pamphlets for kids who had lost a parent, with titles about it's okay to cry, or it's okay to be sad, it's okay to be angry. And I thought, oh my God, I wish I had had that. I was delighted that today's kids have that resource, but I did not have it. In the course of my research, I also learned that preteen boys are especially vulnerable. And they're because they are kind of in this between stage between being so connected to their mothers and when they get a little older, kind of learning how to be a man. They're in that in-between stage, so they're, very, very vulnerable. So I understood that's why I was crying Danny, I think, The CEO of Facebook, Sheryl Sandberg, her husband died a few years ago, and they had young children. And she wrote a book about it. And she said that she was following the new protocol. She was actually asking some of her husband's friends to make videos recalling memories of her husband. So her children would have those ever after. That's the new model of the kind of what you're supposed to do. So at some point I was doing my research again on this, and you were Googling, I was Googling grief and that other related words. And I found this resource at Columbia University. And it was called the Center for Complicated Grief. And that really caught my eye. I said, what is that? Am I suffering from complicated grief? I don't know. So eventually I signed up with one of their therapists. Now, he happened to be a graduate of the College of Wooster, as I am. And I said, oh, this guy's perfect for me. And he was a wonderful, wonderful help to me. At my first session, at the end of my first session, he handed me a questionnaire, and I was to take it home and then come back and talk about it the next week. And it was all these questions about your grieving. And immediately I knew I was not suffering from complicated grief. Complicated grief is when you're really immobilized. You really can't function. You can't work. It's hard to get through your daily routine. You're really obsessing about the person who has died. And clearly I was not that person. I've lived a very good life. I've thrived in my personal life, in my professional life. And you know, the main reason I think is because I had a wonderful grandmother who came to live with me. We lived with our family after, as my mother went to the hospital, and then she was there for a couple more years. Grandma Cryer was really my savior. Not that my father wasn't a good father, but he was very, very busy. He had lots of evening meetings. And, you know, my grandmother was always there. And that unconditional love is the kind of thing that got me through it. I read a book about resilience by a famous psychologist at Harvard named George Vaillant. And he's been studying generations of Harvard graduates as they move through adulthood. And he periodically goes back to them, interviews them again. And what makes for resilient adults was his subject. And he concluded that having a loving, nurturing adult, whether a parent or someone else, was the key factor. And for me, that adult was Grandma Cryer. So anyway, I did not suffer from complicated grief. That was very clear. So another resource that I leaned on, I live near a campus of Fordham University, which is a Jesuit university here in the city. And they have a center on religion and culture. And every now and then they sponsor interesting panel discussions. And one I saw coming up was about funerals. And given the fact that I was kind of researching this subject, I said, that'll be interesting, I'll go there. And I did, and there were two panel members. One was Alice McDermott, a very famous novelist who writes about Irish American Catholic families. Wonderful novels, by the way, I recommend them. And the other speaker was a very unusual background named Thomas Lynch. He's a funeral director in Milford, Michigan, and not that far from where you are. And he's also unusual for a funeral director. He's a poet and essayist. And by chance, in the course of my work on a newspaper, I had actually interviewed both of them in the past. So I went to this symposium, and it was really fascinating. But I was really struck by something that Thomas Lynch said. He was talking about so-called celebrations of life services after somebody has died. He didn't like that concept. However, for me, the light bulb went off immediately over my head and said, aha, we should have had a celebration of life service where people tell stories about Pauline Spittler Cryer. That would have helped us remember her. So I went back to this counselor and told him about this. And as I was sitting there, I said, maybe we could still do it. Why not? So he said, great idea. So I got in touch with my siblings. They liked the idea as well. My sister said, why don't we do it in Findlay at what used to be the First Methodist Church, is now St. Andrew's Methodist Church. So we did in, actually 4 years ago, in the church parlor. I wrote a service for us based on my research. It's actually the last chapter of this book. And so my siblings were there, and my wife and my sister's husband were there. My sister's husband is a minister. He kind of led the service. My brother David, who has been a Broadway actor and singer, sang the Lord's Prayer. And we had sort of an audience there of 3 couples from Findlay. Dr. Floyd Warren, who's we know as Bud Warren, who's a dentist in town, and his wife, Wanda. My cousin, Mary Lynn Corbin, and her husband was there. And I'm going to forget names, sorry. Barbara Dysinger and her husband. They were our little audience. And it was a very moving experience for all of us. We laughed, we cried, we had some candles lit, lots of photos out. And it was just kind of I don't believe in the word closure, because I think things like this, they're never over, but they become manageable. And my final words to you are, it's never too late to do it. If there are people you would like to honor, you can have a celebration of life service for them too. It's not a crazy idea. It's not a silly idea. It can be very meaningful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dan. I am going to ask for any questions that we may have from our audience here in Findlay. I'm going to start by just making a comment that I also had the opportunity to interview Emma May Gray. She was what a wonderful resource for a local historian, but she was a phenomenal woman, and I interviewed her at 101, and she was still very lucid at that time. And I recorded the interview, and I believe she died at 103 or 104, just as you said a couple of years ago. So that resonated with me. And then Peg Dennis, I am speaking about her at Rotary on Monday, because she was the very first woman in Findlay to wear a Rotary badge. Long before Rotary allowed women in the club, she was given a badge by R.L. Heminger because she came so often to report on the meetings. So just a couple of threads through your lecture that resonated with me. But thank you so much for a very moving topic and story. And so anybody here in the audience that has a question for Dan?
I don't have a question exactly, but I'm the son, the nephew, and the grandson of Methodist ministers. And that was me talking in your opening statement about the life in a parsonage and a community and so forth. And I also was a journalist for a number of years, so I appreciate it.
Dan, were you able to hear any of that?
No.
Okay.
Just as well.
Okay, we have a member of the audience, Tom Schindeldecker, who was also a journalist for many years and a Methodist, the son, nephew and grandson of Methodist.
Just to follow the tail end.
Yeah, so he said he felt like you were talking, he was talking while you were speaking, that it really resonated with him. So I do know that we have one question here that's come up on chat in Zoom from Carol. Was your mother related to Dr. Spittler, who practiced in Findlay during the 1940s and 50s?
How did you know? Yes, that's my grandfather. I am named for him, Dr. Dan Spittler. My parents, as I said, grew up in Hoytville, as I like to think, on either side of the track. My paternal Grandpa Spittler was probably the most distinguished person in town because he was the only doctor in town for many, many years there. And my father's father was, Doc Spittler was my maternal grandfather. My father's father was a tenant farmer who lived outside town. He was tenant farmer, meaning he did not own the land that he farmed. And my father, in a way, always felt he wasn't good enough for the doctor's daughter, you know. It's interesting in that centennial history of Hoytville, there was a marvelous tribute to Doc Spittler, as he was called. He died tragically in an automobile accident, and but he was very much beloved in that community. And yes, that I am related to that person.
And Carol says he was my family doctor, and I remember him making house calls. Do we have any other questions or comments from the folks attending via Zoom? You should be able to unmute yourselves, or if you're not able to do that, if you hold up your hand, I should be able to unmute you. Okay, Suzanne has a comment. Oh, Diana, go ahead, honey.
Okay. Hi. I just wanted to say that I read the book when we first went into being on lockdown, because I saw that you were going to have this program in April. And my mother died when I was a junior in high school, and my younger sister was a fourth grader at Lincoln School. So this book hit home a lot. And I think that the mourning period, or the period where my mother died, was stoicism. Don't say anything, you might upset somebody. And it was kind of cathartic to read your book, because I felt like I had a lot of the same feelings. And we are also in the same class, you and I. I am a class of 61.
Is Roth your maiden name?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. See, I
talked with you at the reunion you came to, and with Pat White Kirkwood.
Oh yes. Okay.
So, but I didn't have to go to stinking Lincoln until the 5th grade.
You know, hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
It's interesting you mentioned 4th grade, because my stepmother was my 4th grade teacher. She was not my stepmother when I was in 4th grade. She was
Right.
Mary Garrison was my teacher. She was a widow with 3 children. My father had 4 children. So about 2 years later, they married. And so suddenly there were 7 children. That was quite a burden on my stepmother. We actually had a board near the kitchen where we had to record where each kid was and when were they coming back, when, you know, in order to keep track of them. It took a while for me to adjust to her. She was in many ways very different from my mother. And I came, especially as an adult, to understand the burden that she took on. I mean, it was just incredible what she had to do. Not only to have suddenly 7 children, but to become a minister's wife, which, especially in that era, was you were really in the spotlight in that role. And she wasn't used to that. She had to stop drinking a beer, for example. And anyway, yeah.
Now, I never had to go through the step parent. Well, I did sort of, but because my father died then 3 years later. So that was sort of how that all ended, sort of. But I'm so happy that it's gotten to. I'm glad they did this with Zoom, because I was really thrilled to be able to talk with you too. Thank you.
Me too. Thank you, Diana. It's good to talk with you. I thought about you when I was reading the book as well. I knew that you'd find many similarities. I now live in Diana's childhood home, so on Glendale Avenue.
And Barbara You can say Barbara Dysinger also was my English teacher in high school. And my father must have thought she was terrific because she is the only teacher he ever requested.
Well, Barbara is on the Zoom call with us too. I'm not sure if she'll be able to talk or not. I'm gonna now ask Suzanne, I'm gonna unmute you. I did see that you had your hand up for a question. Go ahead.
I have more comment than question, but we have a lot in common. I go to St. Andrews now. The church has expanded, and I love it there. And in my Sunday school class are Bud and Wanda, so I know them quite well. It's called the Methomates class for the more mature types. So, and other things I have in common with you, my mother passed with cancer when I was 9. Of course, that's a long time ago. I have a younger sister, or still do, and of course my father remained, and he was a very man's man, wonderful father. But I appreciate what you're talking about in the 1950s, the stiff upper lip. And also I knew, what's her name? Emma May. She was fantastic. She was in a couple of clubs with me, and she didn't know how to say no. She just went right on, and she was wonderful. And so we have all of those things in common. And a very long time ago, I saw your brother when he was very young in a wonderful musical performance of Oklahoma, I think it was, in at Findlay High School in the auditorium at that time. So, and I remember the name because being at St. Andrews, we have all the ministers up, and your father's picture is up, Reverend Cryer. So I knew the name at least. I haven't been here in Findlay for a long, long time, just the last 10 or 15 years. But so I was very interested to hear your remarks, and now I will get your book and read it. I haven't done that.
Thank you, Suzanne. And we do have, for anybody on Zoom that's local or anyone here in the room, we do have a handful of copies of the book still available in our gift shop. And you are also able to find it on Amazon. I know that there were a few other hands that went up on Zoom. So Paula, I'll unmute you. Or wait, okay, so ask to unmute. Can you unmute yourself, Paula? There you go.
Okay. I grew up in Hoytville, and I remember the Spittler name. I didn't know your mother, but I imagine my mother knew her. She graduated in 1950, but I think your mother might have been in one of my aunt or uncle's classes too. My father lived in Hoytville when he married my mother until this past March. He passed away. And I'm thinking as I listen to you that not only as an 8-year-old child, but as a 62-year-old, I felt that it was very difficult to honor my father when he passed away because it was during this pandemic, and we have still not had a service, and I don't think we will until next year, depending on how the pandemic goes. So I'm thinking, well, at least I'll have this time to find out a little bit more about my father by looking at pictures and reading letters and things like that. He grew up in Tennessee, and fortunately for us, he decided to write a book. And so he started writing about 14 years ago stories of his childhood. And so I've been going through those and all the pictures and everything. The only bad thing about this is there are hardly any names written on the backs of the pictures. So I'm having trouble figuring out who these people are. But I would like to finish his book, and just for the family, and put pictures with the stories. His stories are wonderful. But I'm just thinking it would be such an honor to give him a celebration of life, and having that book finished. And so I'm this whole year, and I'm doing genealogy right now, and I'm just having a wonderful time getting to know my father, things that I didn't know about him. So I appreciate that you wrote this book about your mother, and it's helping me through my grieving too. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Do we have any, Lynn Corbin, I can see. Lynn, it tells me I should ask you to unmute. Are you able to unmute yourself? There you go.
Yes, I am unmuted. Is that right?
Yes. Yep.
Hi, Dan. Just wanted to say it was a wonderful, wonderful hour, and I've enjoyed it so much. Brought back lots of memories.
I would like to announce that Mary Lynn was the flower girl at my parents' wedding. She may not remember it though.
I remember bits and pieces of it, yes.
That's wonderful. It's really fun. Just so you know, we're recording all of your presentation today, and I love that we're doing that because it's really fun to watch you all reminiscing and coming together via Zoom. Anyone else on Zoom that would like to speak? Have a question or a comment? Don't think I'm seeing anybody. No? Okay, anyone else in the room? Oh, a couple more from the room here. Dan, hold on just a minute. Okay, go ahead, Miriam.
Dan, I would like to say that my brother-in-law's name is George Vance, and he was very good friend to your brother John, and they were both in the musical Oklahoma in the year that that was put on at Findlay High School. And when I am back home after this presentation, I'm going to send a long email to him about your presentation today and tell him that you have a good book. He will be Frederickson's memory to Findlay and the Cryer family.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, Dan, this comment was from Miriam Vance. She was talking about her brother-in-law, George Vance, was also in Oklahoma with your brother, and she's going to be going home after today's lecture and speaking with him or writing him a note. Oh, he lives in France now, so she'll be communicating with him, and she looks forward to reading the book.
Hello. You could tell her. I remember the name George Vance very well. Hello. I remember the name George Vance very well. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
We can, yes. She said great. Thank you.
But please tell George that my brother John died in December from cancer.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, we're all very sorry to hear that. We didn't know that.
Yeah.
She will relay that. I think we have another comment from Connie Sprague, who's in the audience. I'm sorry that you're not able to hear them directly, but I will try to paraphrase. Okay, you would know her as Connie Cole.
Oh yes.
And I remember his family well, and had very happy memories of Reverend Fire and his wonderful sermons as a kid.
She has Yes, she has wonderful memories of attending church and listening to your father's sermons. She certainly remembers you and was bringing up a few other names of the inner city kids, Dick Barchant and Pat White and some others.
Thank you for coming, Connie. It's good to hear from you.
Okay, we have another comment that came up on chat. From Jan, do you know anything about the funeral service that occurred for your mother?
I do have the, yes, I do have, it was a very, the church in fact was packed with parishioners and people from the community, my brother's football coaches and some of my teachers. In fact, the woman who became my stepmother was there. The Bishop of Ohio, the Methodist Ohio group was in charge. My father was very well known throughout the denomination in Ohio, so there were lots of other ministers from Ohio there. And, but here's the thing, I believe it's the next Sunday. My father, instead of standing back and having somebody else take charge of the service, he preached the sermon the next week. And I have that sermon, and I quote from it in the book. And it's, to me, it's extraordinary because I can't imagine how he was able to do that, number one. But again, it was part of that stoicism. You know, you have to keep doing your job. You have to keep meeting your obligations. And my mother's name is never mentioned. And when I first read that, that really hurt me. I said, he can't even mention her name. But then I understood. If he had mentioned her name, he probably would have broken down and would not have been able to continue. So in fact, I guess I remember that sermon because I have it better than the service itself. I remember the smell of the flowers and how those, I think it was lilies, and how ever after I hated that smell. It wasn't smell, it was a stink. So that made a very strong impression on me, clearly.
Thank you. Anyone else on Zoom? I can look for raised hands, or you can go ahead and unmute yourself if you have a question or comment. Okay. I think that may be it from us today, Dan. We truly appreciate your time. This has been really nice for everybody to come together from all across the country, and we appreciate you sharing this personal story with all of us. I know many who haven't read the book will be doing so now, and I hope that we'll still be able to meet in person at some point in the future. But stay well.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Nice to see you all.